In this presentation, we will be discussing how Christianity appears in the People's Republic of China, as it is a communist nation. On the right side of this slide, you will see three buildings, all of which are of Christian denominations, and all of which are located within the borders of China. The top left is St. Joseph's Catholic Church in Beijing. The top right is a temple of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints located in Hong Kong. Finally, the bottom image is of the Sanyi International Protestant Church in the city of Kunming in China. All of these buildings stand as an example that religious persons in China are diverse, both within and outside of Christianity. But this lecture will go over specifically how Christian churches exist in China. We will begin with the history of communism in the People's Republic of China, as well as the history of Christianity in China. We'll then discuss the Christian missionary work amid communistic rule. We'll then discuss how different religious groups endure persecution of different kinds, and we'll end with the current standpoint of Christianity and communism in China today.
Historical context. While China was not the first country to practice communism, it definitely went about communism in a new way. Russia, and then turning into the Soviet Union, was first to establish communism. Following suit, China formed two political parties. One, the nationalists, who believed in Western ideologies, practices, and wanted to see change like other countries in the West. And two, the communists, who followed after Russia. While both these parties attempted to appeal to the peasants, ultimately communism won their favor by promising literacy for even the lowest classes. In 1921, after proclaiming the advantages of communism to the peasants of China, China began what would be 2 decades of inter-country warfare. This civil war would raise up Mao Zedong, who in 1949 created the People's Republic of China, officially starting and practicing communism in China. Historical context. On the other hand, Christianity in China had been taught by foreigners as early as 635 AD. While numbers are not exact, it is estimated that 3 million Catholics and 1 million Protestants were recorded in China in 1948 as practicing these religions. During this time of Christian prosperity, there were estimated to be 50,000 foreign missionaries living in China and preaching some sort of Christianity, mainly Protestant and Catholic missionaries. In 1898, a group of boxers, under the influence of 2 lower leaders who wanted to gain power for themselves against the current emperor of China, who was in the beginning phases of inviting foreigners into China to industrialize the country. These 2 leaders that wanted to gain power that these foreign people would possess decided to retaliate against the emperor. These boxers victimized liberals and foreigners, and just a couple of years later took this retaliation to a new level by murdering 135 Protestant missionaries and approximately 50 Catholic missionaries, with almost 100 children murdered as well, in addition to killing many Christian Chinese converts. While missionary work wasn't officially banned during this rebellion, the Boxer Rebellion destroyed the path for foreign missionaries in China.
The first stage of China's Christianity within communism. During the beginning of communism in China, when communism was officially practiced, Christian religions were not denounced or banned. According to the Constitution of the People's Republic of China, the country has freedom of religion. However, they were greatly oppressed by the government with strict regulations and by social hostility and pressure. The government, in turn, did not ban religions, but instead was allowed to regulate normal religious activities. This may seem fair on paper, but was drastically far from reality. As Christian people suffered with persecution, both physically and verbally, they also had to deal with great destruction of their sacred buildings, or, as John W. Maslin described, Christianity was controlled through supervision and intimidation. In addition to all of this, foreign proselyting missionaries were not allowed to teach and continue growing Christianity in China.
In the next few slides, we'll go into detail about specific time periods in the last century and give only a few highlights of Christianity in China from each time period. The first time period that we will discuss is from 1902 to 1927. This period of time was a high point for the foreign missionary age in China. However, not all these missionaries were Christian missionaries. China was modernizing along with having a new political leader in 1915. They received positive public opinion from the USA because the president of China at the time called upon Protestant Christians to pray for the government. This event was criticized by the British as a political ploy. Nonetheless, it gave positivity to the Christianity movement in China. Another reason for flourishing Christian communities in China during these 2 decades may have been spurred by the Boxer events of 1900. Deaths of martyrs prompted more missionary applicants from the East Coast colleges and were a part of the Yale China mission in the early 1900s. The number of Protestant missionaries was 3,500 in 1905 and grew to 5,500 by 1915. The growth in membership of Protestants grew from about 100,000 people in 1900 to about 500,000 in 1920. As a consequence of this growth, there were mission schools, which had almost 170,000 students in 1915, and by the 20s reached almost 250,000. These schools had a significant impact on educating girls and women, as well as bringing cross-cultural awareness to students. The next time period is from 1927 to 1950. The Christian missions had some ups and downs during this time period. Part of the issue was to do with internal conflict between liberal or modernists and fundamentalists or conservatives. Other reasons for declining advancement compared to the first 2 decades of the 20th century included events in the political atmosphere. In 1927, a new national government was set up and was much more open to foreigners and missionaries than previously, though there were still rules and that missionaries had to abide by the nationalist government, including having Chinese heads of schools and Chinese patriarchal political instruction in the schools. A significant event in 1932 happened where a Presbyterian lady, born in China of missionary parents, her name was Pearl Buck. She spoke to an audience of Presbyterian women in New York City, where she criticized the missionaries for being narrow-minded, arrogant, and ignorant. Another event was a publication of a 7-volume book titled Rethinking Missions, A Layman's Inquiry After 100 Years. The publication focused on China and was commissioned by John D. Rockefeller Jr. It contained modernist theory and was highly criticized by fundamentalists and evangelical Christians. While there was internal conflict, the Great Depression had an effect on the missions at this time. Missionaries had set up YMCAs, hospitals, schools, and colleges. Due to the lack of funds in maintaining the facilities during the Depression, many missionaries returned home in the 1930s. During this period of time, the Second World War hit and impacted the missionary programs in China, as missionaries needed to return home for safety. This placed more responsibility on the indigenous leaders as they had to take over leadership and functions that were mostly done by Western missionaries. The Civil War in China was from 1945 to 49, and the Communist Party of China was victorious. The political landscape changed as the Communist Party changed laws and took more power from the people to live freely. The next time period we'll discuss is from 1950 to 1966. With the emergence of the Communist Party in China, this meant Protestant and Catholic Christians would be subject to a powerful state that could demand their obedience. The new political party incorporated Marxist dogma, which was adverse to religions. They created policies to which Christian churches needed to comply, and which had the purpose to reduce and eliminate religion. From 1949 to 1954, it was a time of compliance for Christian churches. Catholics were particularly resistant to the Communist Party as the papacy was against communism. Catholics had quite a presence in China at this time than might be thought. They had 110,000 followers in Shanghai at the time, which was about 1.8% of the population of the city, which was about 6 million population. Catholics had more followers and was rooted in rural areas. They had less colleges and hospitals than Protestants, but they were resistant, and as a consequence, some were killed in the process of confiscating land or property, according to the communist regime. This period of time was one where Christians had to get used to the new rules and regulations in the new China. It was a hard time where religious belief was nearly criminalized itself, and believers harassed and mistreated.
Chinese minorities and Christianity. As China allowed foreign missionaries to enter their country in the early 20th century, many of them found success among the minority communities, such as the Hmong. They converted to Christianity quickly and in large numbers. Samuel Pollard was a very prominent English missionary who had a lot of success with the poor and marginalized Hmong, who were feared and hated by the majority, known as the Han. Of this mass conversion, in his own words, he wrote, "Some days they came in 10s and 20s, some days in 60s and 70s. Then came 100, then came 200, 300, 400. At last, on one special occasion, 1,000 of these mountain men came in a single day." Pictured on the left is an example of a Christian church built by the Hmong. It's called the Gospel Church, and it's over a century old, located in modern-day Guangzhou. It has survived Bible burnings and forced closure, and is still standing today and well attended by many Christians. Those who joined Christianity for material benefits during this time were labeled as Rice Bowl Christians. The two main motivating factors for people to join Christianity were the benefits of Western medicine, including smallpox vaccinations, and the other was the promise of literacy and education. Pictured on the right is the Morrison School, the first Christian school in China established in 1842. Widespread literacy and education threatened the Chinese status quo, where only the elite could read and write. This threat led to tension and decades of persecution and violence between the communist government and the people. Persecution. The persecution and mistreatment of Chinese Christians has not always remained the same, and has also varied widely from region to region. For some, like the Hmong, it was not uncommon for them to be mistreated by their landlords, especially when they became wealthy. One man, after rising out of poverty, drew the jealous attention of his non-Christian neighbors and was accused of stealing. His son was arrested and tied up for a month, then was beaten on the back with a sword and had his thumbs pinched with hot tongs. Although many Christians were oppressed, some were more persecuted than others. During the 1970s and 80s, the Chinese Communist Party formed the only three official Christian churches in China: the Three Self-Patriotic Movement, the China Christian Council, and the Chinese Patriotic Catholic Association, all of which are regulated by the State Administration for Religious Affairs, who controls who is selected as clergy members and how doctrine is interpreted to ensure it conforms with traditional Chinese beliefs. The Chinese government does not officially recognize any other Christian church which does not conform to one of these three groups. Even within these churches, local Christians and foreigners are kept strictly segregated in their own separate congregations to ensure that there is no cultural exposure to Western ideologies. For those who do not fit into the stable, regulated churches, they are forced into house churches or family churches, which are in-home gatherings of believers where they can practice their religious beliefs secretly.
One key player in modern-day China is their current president, Xi Jinping. Xi is known for enforcing stronger regulations, which we will talk about in the following slide, as well as known for a strong obedience to the Communist Party. A quote from the late Chinese scholar of literature and religion, Anthony C. Yu, sums up well the practices of President Xi. Yu is quoted, "The impetus to engage religion on the part of the central government is for the purpose of regulation, control, and exploitation whenever it is deemed feasible and beneficial to the state." The relationship between the Chinese government and religious practice has less to do with the actual beliefs and teachings of different churches, as it has to do with the power that religion possesses to invoke allegiance to an entity other than the Chinese leaders. President Xi, though oppressive to religious activity because of his enforcement of communistic ideals, doesn't openly ridicule or disregard religion simply because he dislikes or discredits pious rituals. His devotion is merely to the People's Republic of China and to the Communist Party. In a conference early in his presidential reign, Xi urges religious individuals to merge religious doctrines with Chinese culture in an effort to devote themselves to their country. He does not prohibit ecclesiastical activity. That being said, many believers feel that the laws he enforces make religious practice near impossible. In recent years, there has been a greater push for government crackdown on religious groups. In 2018, President Xi Jinping instituted new regulations and guidelines that had to be followed by religious parties in order to comply with government rule. These include stricter demands for churches to become registered congregations, less religious independence as government leaders have greater control on church activities, as well as increased supervision over churches' online presence, their donations, and other religious practices. The government continues to hold tight reins when it comes to religious symbols as well. In March of 2020, Chinese officials removed many crosses and other religious symbols from churches and buildings, saying that these types of depictions cannot be physically higher than the country's flag. This is an example of a continued effort of sinification in China, or the act of adapting non-Chinese ideas into traditional Chinese culture and influence. The goal is to stop believers from becoming too focused on religious figures and symbols so that they are more dependent on the Communist Party and its leaders. A major part of this sinification includes the punishments imposed on those who do not comply with the Communist Party rules. In 2020, Pastor Wang Yi of Chengdu's Early Rain House Church received a 9-year prison sentence. In 2018, he, along with nearly 100 members of his congregation, were apprehended for leading or participating in an underground church. This unregistered congregation went against the regulations for churches to be recognized by the Chinese government, and was looked at as a subversion of state power. This is an example of the tension between the government and the religious peoples. When Chinese leaders feel as though congregations have stepped out of bounds, they are quick to reprimand them in an effort to retain control of their populations. A few key points to remember regarding Christianity in China amid communistic reign is that the Chinese people do officially have freedom of religion, though from the standpoint of an American in the United States, it looks a little bit different than the freedom of religion that we experience in our country. Missionary work in China was common prior to World War II, but is now officially forbidden in modern-day China. Persecutions are very common for both Christians and members of other denominations and faiths, because those persecutions are backed by political agendas. And Christianity, despite all that goes on amid political rule and policies, it is growing, but that is at an extremely slow pace, just because of those policies that are in place to retain focus and devotion of Chinese people to the Communist Party and its leaders.